The children were still screaming when Prince Zorrin laughed. Not the dignified chuckle Sarah had taught him for diplomatic receptions, but the delighted giggle of a child pulling wings off insects. Through the static-filled transmission from New Geneva, she could hear the festival music still playing some human folk song about peace and friendship, while 2 million voices joined it in a very different kind of harmony. "Did I do well, Professor?" Zorrin's scaled face filled her screen. Those golden eyes she'd spent 20 years teaching to recognize human emotions now bright with the joy of successful destruction. "I calculated the cultural impact exactly as you taught us. Maximum psychological damage with minimal resource expenditure." Sarah's hand moved to a small music box that had been waiting on her desk since the day she'd first met him. 20 years of steadiness. 20 years of patience. 20 years of the most careful lie ever told. "Perfect, Your Highness," she said softly. "Absolutely." "Perfect," she said even softer. She opened the box, and the first notes of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony began to play a simple melody that had been woven into 20 years of lectures, embedded in every lesson about human ethics, hidden in the harmonic frequencies of her voice during every discussion of what humans consider unconscionable. As the melody drifted through the Academy's communication system, emergency alarms began wailing across every deck. You might think 20 years is a long time to hold a grudge. It's not. 20 years is exactly how long it takes to hollow out an enemy's mind and rebuild it with something better. The symphony's opening theme contained a specific harmonic frequency Sarah had woven into every lecture about human protective instincts, every discussion of ethics, every analysis of what humans consider unconscionable. Admiral HFY felt something shift in his mind. His targeting computer chimed, but his finger wouldn't pull the trigger. The human evacuation ship on his screen contained children, his mind insisted, though his species had no word for the protective fury now burning in his chest. Commander Yelana's hunting instincts fired: target, acquired, fire, destroy, consume. But 20 years of human cultural studies whispered different words: children, protect, nurture, preserve. The thoughts crashed together, leaving her paralyzed at her weapons console. "Professor Kim," her Zephyrian assistant stammered, his voice crackling with electronic distress as emergency lights bathed the Academy in pulsing red. Statement: confusion detected in all communication channels. Query: harmonic frequency in your music causing system-wide neural interference. Sarah stood, her professor's cardigan now looking less like academic attire and more like camouflage as she moved with military precision. 20 years of expensive education activating across known space, Vextal. You're hearing the sound of understanding. The Academy's communication boards lit up like festival displays as reports flooded in from across the galaxy fleets, stopping mid-attack. Commanders refusing orders. Weapon systems being locked out by their own crews. Sarah reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a military communication device that definitely didn't belong to any professor of primitive cultures. What do you call it? When a teacher's lesson finally clicks. When 37 alien fleet commanders suddenly understand human ethics in the middle of a shooting war. The universe calls it irony. Humans call it justice. The Galactic Military Academy's Emergency Communication Board called it a complete systems failure. Status reports painted an impossible picture. Hegemony Battle Fleet 7 had stopped mid-bombardment and was requesting humanitarian aid coordinates. Admiral HFY had just ordered his dreadnought to screen human civilian evacuations from his own fleet. Commander Yelana was broadcasting surrender terms to ships she was supposed to be destroying. A countdown timer appeared on Sarah's hidden military interface: 47 minutes until the last refugee ships reached safety. 23 minutes until Zorrin's reinforcements arrived. 6 hours until her conditioning began to fade. "Thessalessans?" hissed General Sithrex over the emergency channel, his reptilian voice thick with confusion as his words stretched into agonized syllables. "They burn in our mints like acid. Cannot target. Cannot kill." Professor taught USS. What did she teach, USS? The Academy's commandant stared at his tactical displays as his military doctrine dissolved in real time, his crest flattening in distress. "This is impossible. Our psychological evaluation protocols would have detected any deep cover operative." "They did," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that made seasoned officers step back. "I scored high on empathy, emotional stability, and genuine affection for my students. All of that was real." The device in her hand beeped, and she watched as the symphony's second movement began broadcasting across her hidden network. You can't fake caring about someone for 20 years, but you can teach them to care about the right things. She closed her eyes, remembering a younger Prince Zorrin staying after class, his voice curious. "Professor, why do humans write poetry about pain?" Logic suggests avoiding reminders of unpleasant experiences. "Because, Zorrin," she had explained, "transforming suffering into meaning is how we survive it. Pain shared becomes compassion, compassion shared becomes wisdom." "Professor Kim!" Zorrin's voice erupted from the speakers, cracking with rage and bewilderment. "What have you done to my fleet?" Sarah smiled as 17 archaeological sites across the galaxy began transmitting activation codes in perfect synchronization. When you label something an archaeological site, people stop noticing the massive energy signatures emanating from underground. Selective observation works wonders when you're convinced you're dealing with harmless academics studying dead civilizations. The first Earth Defense Command vessel emerged from what Prince Zorrin's intelligence had catalogued as Human Historical Research Station Gamma 7, then another, then 17 more, each appearing in perfect formation around his fragmenting fleet, ships that shouldn't exist, technology that violated known physics, weapons that made his dreadnoughts look like children's toys. "Statement, impossible technology detected?" stammered a Zephyrian tactical officer, his voice rising to an electronic shriek. Query, how do primitive humans possess gravitational manipulation drives? Answer. Sarah replied pleasantly, now standing in what was clearly a military command center that had somehow existed beneath the academy for decades. The same way your primitive professor spent 20 years mapping every weakness in your military doctrine. Her tactical display showed the space battle unfolding around Zorrin's fleet like a virus, attacking its own cells. Ships meant to hunt humans were screening their escape routes. Weapons designed to crack planets cleared debris from evacuation corridors. Predators learning to become prey, then choosing to become shepherds. Admiral Kethvar's voice cut through the chaos. Professor, Colonel, I don't know what to call you anymore. But I understand now why you spent 3 semesters on human concepts of proportional response. Yes, Admiral, she replied, watching another section of his fleet turn to protect human civilians. You do? The question is, what will you do about it? The countdown timer showed 23 minutes until Zorrin's reinforcements arrived. But Sarah's network was already tracking Themand, the commanders she'd taught 5, 10, 15 years ago who were now receiving the same harmonic conditioning that was tearing apart Zorrin's forces. She remembered teaching them all. Remembered Prince Zorrin asking about human military doctrine. Professor Kim, human strategy seems inefficient. Why do they risk resources to protect non-combatants? Because, Prince Zorrin, she had said, the moment you stop protecting the innocent is when you become the very thing you're fighting against. Efficiency without ethics isn't strategy. It's organized brutality. On her tactical display, she watched as Zorrin's own bridge crew slowly turned their weapons on their command staff. There's a moment in every predator's life when it realizes it's become prey. For Prince Zorrin, that moment arrived when his own tactical officer pointed a plasma rifle at his chest. Sir! The officer's voice trembled, scales rippling with distress patterns Zorrin had never seen before. I cannot allow you to target civilian populations. The professor taught us that honor requires. The professor, Zorrin snarled, his golden eyes finding Sarah's face on the command screen, pupils dilating in rage, taught us to be weak. No, Sarah said, her voice carrying across every communication channel in his fleet with the authority of 20 years of absolute trust. I taught you to be strong enough to choose mercy. There's a difference. The symphony's third movement reached its crescendo, transmitted through quantum communication arrays to every ship that had ever hosted one of her former students. Across the battle space, Zorrin's forces consumed themselves, not from human weapons, but from the realization that everything they'd believed about strength was wrong. Commander Yelana's report crackled through with clicks of distress. Fleet Command. Weapons systems locked out by crew refusal. Cannot fire on evacuation vessels containing offspring. Captain Thex. Sir, my gunners are demanding to know why we're targeting a cultural center. They're asking about the children, the small ones who couldn't fight back. General Sithrex. My hunting instincts scream to kill, but the human lessons whisper of honor. Cannot reconcile. Cannot function. Sarah's countdown timer showed critical numbers. 6 minutes until conditioning window expired. 12 minutes for the last refugee ship to reach safety. 8 minutes until Zorrin's reinforcements arrived. Those reinforcements were already reporting the same symptoms. Weapons refusing to lock on to human targets. Crews questioning orders. Commanders paralyzed by the ethical frameworks Sarah had embedded in their minds. She closed her eyes and remembered teaching them all. Every officer who'd sat in her classroom, discussing human poetry and philosophy, learning to understand the species they were meant to destroy, they'd trusted her, loved her, even. She'd used that love to save her species. Sarah's finger hovered over the final movement control. Once she pressed it, there would be no going back. The fourth movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony contains the Ode to Joy, a piece about universal brotherhood, the triumph of human spirit, and the dream of peace among all peoples. It's also the activation key for the deepest level of psychological conditioning ever attempted. Sarah's finger hovered over the control. Once she activated this, there would be no going back. The conditioning would be permanent, irreversible. Every student she'd ever taught would be forever changed, forever marked by her manipulation. 20 years. Prince Zorrin whispered as he watched her hesitate, his voice breaking with betrayal and understanding. 20 years you made me love you. The words hit harder than any weapon. She remembered the young prince who'd stayed after class to discuss human poetry, who'd brought her gifts from his homeworld, who'd asked her to explain why humans celebrated their warriors and mourned their enemies. Yes, Sarah said, her own voice thick with emotion she'd hidden for decades. Because the alternative was extinction, not just ours but yours too. I've seen the projections, Zorrin. Your people's plan wasn't conquest. It was complete elimination of human consciousness from the universe. Her finger moved to the control. Around Zorrin's flagship, vessels from his own fleet had positioned themselves defensively, commanded by officers who could no longer reconcile his orders with everything they'd learned about honor, duty, and the protection of those who couldn't protect themselves. Every lesson about human bonding patterns, he said, tears flowing down his scaled cheeks. Every discussion of our primitive emotional attachments, every analysis of our irrational protective instincts. You were teaching us to understand exactly what we were destroying, and teaching you to be incapable of destroying it once you truly understood. She pressed the control. The Ode to Joy theme began. It's broadcast across the galaxy, but Sarah described it as it played, children's voices singing of joy and brotherhood, Zorrin, innocent voices celebrating the dream of peace among all peoples. The same voices you silenced on New Geneva. Zorrin's hand moved toward his ship's self-destruct controls. You've destroyed everything I was, everything I believed. My own officers won't follow my orders. My people will see me as the commander who lost a war to a single human teacher. Don't. The word came out sharp, 20 years of genuine affection breaking through her military precision. Please? Why not? His golden eyes met hers across the impossible distance, and she saw the broken child in them, the student who'd wanted to understand. Because you're still my student, she said, and for the first time in hours, her voice carried the warmth they all remembered. And I still believe you can learn from this. Zorrin's hand trembled as it hovered over the self-destruct controls. In the distance, the final refugee ship reported it had reached safety. The thing about understanding someone deeply enough to destroy them completely is that it's the same skill you need to love them. Prince Zorrin stared at the self-destruct panel for what felt like centuries. Around him, his bridge crew waited, no longer his enemies, no longer his allies, but something new. Something Sarah had created in the space between loyalty and conscience. The final notes of the symphony faded, replaced by the hum of ships powering down their weapons. Across the galaxy, the most powerful military alliance in known history was surrendering not to superior firepower, but to the realization that they'd been wrong about everything that mattered. Finally, Zorrin's hand moved away from the destruct sequence. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice small and lost. "Now you go home," Sarah said, her own command center growing quiet as the battle ended without a single human shot being fired. "You tell your people what you've learned. You help them understand that humans aren't primitive, we're just different. And you work with us to make sure New Geneva never happens again. And you? What happens to the beloved Professor Kim?" Sarah smiled, and it was both the warm teacher's smile her students remembered and something sadder, more complex. "I retire from teaching. 20 years is enough." The academy around them was transforming, walls retracting to reveal the military installation it had always been. But Sarah found herself thinking not of victory, but of all the young minds she'd shaped, all the students who'd trusted her while she prepared to break their hearts. "Professor," Zorrin said quietly, "in your human poetry, is there forgiveness for teachers who love their students enough to betray them?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but I hope we'll find out together." 20 years later, former Prince Zorrin stood before a memorial on New Geneva built, now, more beautiful than before. The names of 2 million humans covered the curved wall like a constellation of accusations, but also like a reminder of what he'd learned that day, that understanding someone deeply enough to destroy them is the same skill you need to love them. He placed yellow roses at the base of the wall. Sarah had taught him they meant remembrance and sorrow. He whispered words in the human language she'd made him practice. "I'm sorry. I understand now." Across the galaxy, in classrooms on a dozen worlds, other former students of Professor Kim taught new courses with names like Human Ethics, Applied Empathy, and the one that always drew the largest crowds, Why Some Lines Should Never Be Crossed, a Military History. Each class began the same way, with a recording of Sarah's voice explaining the day she'd activated the most successful psychological operation in galactic history. Her words were matter-of-fact, clinical, but underneath was the sound of a teacher who genuinely loved her students. Education, you see, isn't about filling minds with information. It's about shaping hearts with understanding. And sometimes, if you're very careful and very patient and very willing to sacrifice everything you are for everything they could become, you can teach someone to choose love over fear, compassion over conquest, mercy over might. The recording always ended with the same question. The choice, as always, is yours. What will you choose to teach? What will you choose to learn? And in classrooms across the galaxy, young mindshuman, alien, and everything in between raised their hands to answer. The universe, as it turns out, is an excellent teacher, but sometimes it needs a substitute.